Thank you, Murtaz, and thank you, Grant, for those insights. So I'm here from Redistress, an organisation that pursues justice and reparation for survivors of torture. And Redistress, in collaboration with partners, including the organisations represented on this panel, have published a report last year with a detailed legal analysis concluding that Egyptian authorities' use of torture is so widespread and systematic as to account to a crime against humanity under customary international law, by which Egypt is bound. And there are copies of the report at the back of the room if you'd like to pick one up. So I'm going to outline why it's important to highlight torture in Egypt as a crime against humanity. I'll run through the legal definition and how it meets it, and I'll talk about what states can be doing next to end torture in Egypt. So first of all, why is it important to recognize torture in Egypt as a crime against humanity? Well, there are both practical and legal values to doing so, and to recognizing torture in Egypt as an international crime, and not just as individual isolated incidents, but instead as a pattern or a state policy of using torture to suppress dissent. So first of all, those practical values. So many countries have diplomatic relationships with Egypt, and Egypt, in fact, is the second largest recipient of US international military aid after Israel. So the fact that international crimes are happening in Egypt should have an impact on those diplomatic, financial, or political relationships, and it should be alarming to allies and cause repercussions for the Egyptian authorities. There's also a legal value to recognizing torture in Egypt as a crime against humanity, because that would impose obligation on states to seek accountability for the Egyptian government. So how does torture in Egypt constitute a crime against humanity? So first of all, the consistency of the publicly available data on torture in Egypt establishes a clear pattern of abuse, as opposed to individual or isolated or ad hoc acts of misconduct, which is what the Egyptian government claims it is. The pattern includes similarities in the way that arbitrary arrests and detention are carried out, and the authorities involved, such as the National Security Agency or the National Police or other security agencies. There is especially a pattern in those targeted, which includes the political opposition, politicians, lawyers, journalists, bloggers, academics, and human rights defenders, especially those from marginalized identities such as women and gender rights activists and LGBTIQ+ individuals. Now, the purpose of this arrest and torture is mostly to suppress dissent, in response to real or perceived political or human rights activism. And the methods of torture also have a pattern. We see both physical and psychological torture used as a political tool to stifle dissent. By identifying and analyzing these patterns, of course, yeah. By identifying and analyzing these patterns, and of course by recognizing the huge number of reported cases, we established the existence of a widespread and systematic use of torture in Egypt, as well as a state policy to use torture. Other elements that contribute to the existence of a state policy include the Egyptian government constantly using measures such as states of emergency to create loopholes in the law and circumventing the rights of its citizens under the Constitution and international law, allowing for a systematic commission of torture. The Egyptian government also uses anti-terrorism legislation as a pretext for various human rights violations, including torture, with impunity. And the culture of impunity in Egypt is an integral part of a state policy that allows for the perpetration of torture without fear of penalty by the Egyptian authorities. The majority of torture survivors in Egypt, in fact, do not pursue domestic claims against their torturers, as they fear further abuses and reprisals, and do not believe that justice can be done. Claims by survivors who do report to state prosecutors are often ignored and rarely investigated. Egypt's legal framework to criminalize torture does fall short of international standards under the UN Convention Against Torture, and therefore creates actual or potential loopholes that allow for impunity. we also see a lack of independence of the judiciary in Egypt, and the unsanctioned acts and omissions of the judiciary, such as the Supreme State Security Prosecution, allow for the arbitrary arrest or incommunicado detention of its citizens, as well as impunity in cases of reported torture, further showing the existence of a state policy that encourages and enables the use of torture and other violations to suppress dissent. The final legal framework that torture in Egypt accounts for to create the definition of crimes against humanity is the knowledge element, or the fact that the Egyptian government must know what is going on. So the widely available documentation of the prevalence of torture in Egypt, which includes decisions from regional and UN human rights bodies communicated to the Egyptian government, as well as NGO and media reports, establish that the highest spheres of the state must know or should know that torture is being used against dissenters and others in Egypt. So I'll finish by saying what the international community and what states should be doing next. So states should look into their political, diplomatic and financial relationships with Egypt in light of the violations we know it is carrying out. They should recognize torture in Egypt as a crime against humanity and be public in doing so, to promote any methods of accountability possible, including sanctions such as travel bans or seizing assets belonging to Egypt in their countries. The Universal Periodic Review of Egypt is coming up, and states should be making representations directly to Egypt, but also calling on Egypt's allies to make stronger recommendations to end torture there. And many organizations have been calling on the Human Rights Council to establish a monitoring mechanism or even an investigative mechanism for Egypt, which at the moment does not have one. So states should be joining forces with civil society to make these calls. Thank you.